What happens when a legendary martial artist and Hollywood icon agrees to a routine late-night interview, only to find himself the target of a planned ambush meant to undermine him on national television? Tonight we examine the tense exchange that led to security being called onto the Jimmy Kimmel live set, and why Chuck Norris ultimately walked off during what became one of the most talked-about interviews in late-night history. This is a story about respect, dignity, and the consequences of crossing a professional boundary. Be sure to subscribe and leave a comment below. This is a story that just might change how you view late-night TV. Chuck Norris stepped onto the Jimmy Kimmel live stage with his usual quiet confidence, the kind that comes from years of martial arts mastery and a long-standing Hollywood career. The crowd welcomed him with enthusiastic applause, clearly thrilled to see the action star who had grown into a cultural icon. He took his seat, adjusting his jacket with precision. "Chuck Norris, everyone," Jimmy said, flashing his familiar grin. "Thanks for being here, Chuck." "Appreciate the invite, Jimmy," Chuck responded, his tone calm and respectful. "So Chuck, I've got to ask," Jimmy began, leaning in with what appeared to be a friendly look, though there was a hint of something more pointed behind it. "You know all those Chuck Norris facts online, stuff like Chuck Norris counted to infinity twice or Chuck Norris can divide by zero. What's your take on becoming such a viral figure?" Chuck nodded thoughtfully. "Honestly, Jimmy, I think it's a compliment. People have had fun with the image, and some of those jokes are pretty clever. My family enjoys them." Sure, Jimmy replied, though his smile started to shift. "But here's what I really wonder. Do you ever think those jokes have kind of reduced you to a caricature? I mean, when's the last time you actually did something that lived up to the legend of Chuck Norris?" The question lingered in the air like a quiet provocation. Chuck's expression remained composed, but there was a noticeable change in his posture, a slight shift that martial artists would recognize as a sign of alertness. "Could you clarify what you mean by that, Jimmy?" Chuck asked, evenly. "Well," Jimmy said, his tone adopting a mock-innocent edge, "you're known as this ultimate tough guy, right? But you're in your 80s now. These days you're doing infomercials for fitness gear. It's been a while since your last big movie. Isn't it time to admit that the Chuck Norris image is more myth than reality?" The room had noticeably quieted. Chuck looked at Jimmy for a long moment before responding. "Jimmy, I've had a long career doing what I'm passionate about. I've been fortunate enough to entertain, teach martial arts, and serve my country. At this point in my life, I don't feel a need to prove anything." "But that's exactly it," Jimmy continued, his tone now more direct. "You've created this entire image of being unbeatable, untouchable. But what have you actually done that sets you apart? I mean, Bruce Lee was a philosopher who transformed martial arts. Jackie Chan is still performing his own stunts into his 60s. Steven Seagal, well, maybe not the best example." The audience chuckled awkwardly at the comment, but Chuck remained serious. "What's your point, Jimmy?" he asked, his voice calm but firmer now. "All I'm saying," Jimmy said, gesturing as though trying to be fair, "is that maybe it's time we talk honestly about the difference between the Chuck Norris myth and the real person. You were a decent action star in the 80s and 90s, you had a TV run, and you won a few karate championships, but somehow you've become this larger-than-life character. And I wonder if maybe you've started to buy into your own legend." Chuck stayed silent for a few moments, and the audience seemed to recognize a shift in the tone of the conversation. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, but more deliberate. "Jimmy, I came here to talk about my career, my family, and maybe share a few experiences with your viewers. I didn't come here to be insulted." "Insulted?" Jimmy responded with a laugh, though it lacked the ease of earlier. "Chuck, I'm just asking questions. Isn't that what interviews are for? Or do you only do shows where everyone pretends you're actually some kind of superhero?" There's a line between asking questions and trying to undermine someone for entertainment, Chuck said, remaining perfectly composed. "What you're doing now isn't journalism. It's not even thoughtful television. It's just disrespectful." Jimmy's grin was starting to look strained. "Oh, come on, Chuck. Can't take a few tough questions? What happened to the guy who's supposed to be tougher than anyone? Are you about to tear up? Should I grab you a tissue?" The sarcasm in Jimmy's voice was now unmistakable, and a few people in the audience even audibly reacted. Chuck turned slowly to face Jimmy, and for the first time during the segment, Jimmy appeared to realize he might have gone too far. "You know what, Jimmy?" Chuck said, his tone calm but carrying a clear sense of finality. "I've spent more than 40 years in this industry. I've worked with true professionals, and I've also dealt with people who haven't shown the same level of respect. I've been interviewed by those who ask challenging questions to inform their viewers, and by others who do it just to make themselves look sharp at their guests' expense. So which one am I?" Jimmy asked, though his usual confidence seemed to waver. "You tell me," Chuck responded. "Is this your standard approach with all guests, or did you decide to make an exception tonight?" The tension in the studio was clear. Even the band appeared uneasy, and the audience had fallen almost completely silent, aware that this moment had moved far beyond regular talk show back and forth. Jimmy shifted slightly in his seat, beginning to understand that the interview wasn't going according to plan. Still, rather than de-escalate, he leaned in, seemingly unwilling to let Chuck end the conversation on his terms. "Chuck," Jimmy said, attempting to steer things back, "maybe you're overreacting. This is comedy. It's what we do. Poke fun, ask uncomfortable questions, keep things lively. Maybe you're just not used to being questioned." Chuck's expression sharpened slightly. "Questioned, Jimmy? I've faced opponents in the ring who could cause real damage. I've worked with directors who demanded intense physical effort under risky conditions. Life has tested me in ways you likely wouldn't understand. What you're doing isn't a challenge. It's an attempt to mock me for laughs." "Mock you?" Jimmy replied with a dismissive tone. "Chuck, you're a public figure. You've made millions off this tough guy brand. Don't you think the public has a right to see what's behind the persona? Let's be real. When was the last time you were in an actual fight? And I don't mean a staged film scene or a friendly exhibition. I mean a real fight." The question was clearly crafted to provoke a reaction, and Chuck understood that. His voice remained composed, but there was unmistakable firmness in it now. "Are you trying to get me to prove something to you, Jimmy? Because if that's what this is really about, we can address it right here, right now." The audience reacted with a collective gasp, and Jimmy's eyes widened. For a brief moment, he seemed to recognize that he was no longer in control. Whoa, Chuck," Jimmy said, raising his hands and forcing a laugh. "I'm not trying to start a fight. I'm just suggesting that the whole Chuck Norris image is more about marketing and entertainment. And there's nothing wrong with that. Most of Hollywood works the same way." "So you believe I'm just smoke and mirrors?" Chuck asked quietly. "I think you're a savvy entrepreneur who turned a solid martial arts background into a personal brand," Jimmy replied, regaining some of his earlier confidence. "And honestly, good for you. But let's not act like you're really the superhero those internet jokes make you out to be." Chuck remained silent for a long moment, watching Jimmy with the kind of steady concentration that had served him well throughout his career. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm but calm. "Let me ask you something, Jimmy. Do you understand what respect actually means?" "Of course I do," Jimmy said, brushing off the question. "I don't think you do," Chuck continued, "because if you did, you'd know that respect isn't something you earn just by hosting a talk show. It's something you offer to others, especially when they've been invited into your space." "This is my show, Chuck," Jimmy snapped back, the friendly tone now gone. "This is my space, and I can ask any question I choose. If that's a problem, you're free to leave." "Is that what you're saying? You'd rather I walk out?" "I'm saying I want straight answers," Jimmy replied, leaning forward. "I want you to stop hiding behind the myth. Admit it, the Chuck Norris legend is a carefully crafted persona, and the real Chuck is just another aging actor trying to stay relevant." The silence that followed was heavy. Chuck studied Jimmy for what felt like a long pause, then rose slowly from his chair. The movement was smooth and deliberate, with a sense of restrained control that didn't go unnoticed by the room. "You know something, Jimmy," Chuck said, his voice cutting clearly through the now silent studio. "You're right about one thing. The legend of Chuck Norris isn't the same as the man. The legend never shows frustration. The legend never loses composure. The legend stays calm, no matter the situation." Jimmy swallowed hard, suddenly more aware of how imposing Chuck appeared, now that he was on his feet. "But Chuck Norris, the man," Chuck continued, "has spent a lifetime learning about discipline, respect, and integrity. And Chuck Norris, the man, doesn't take kindly to being insulted by someone who thinks hosting a talk show makes him tough. "Chuck, please sit down," Jimmy said, trying to sound authoritative, but not quite succeeding. "This is getting uncomfortable for everyone." "I'm the one making it uncomfortable," Chuck replied with a dry laugh, devoid of amusement. "Jimmy, you brought me here as a guest, and you've spent the entire segment trying to undermine me. You've been disrespectful, unprofessional, and frankly inappropriate. And now you're saying I'm the problem? If you can't handle some playful teasing, maybe interviews aren't for you," Jimmy said, though his tone lacked conviction. "Playful teasing?" Chuck repeated. "Jimmy, there's a line between light-hearted jokes and what you've been doing. You've been trying to embarrass me in front of your audience for entertainment. And worse, you act as if being the host gives you the right to do that." Jimmy started to speak, but Chuck continued without pause. "Let me explain something about respect, Jimmy. In martial arts, we follow a principle called honor. It means treating others, even your opponents, with respect. It's not about tearing someone down to win. It's about striving to improve yourself. But that idea probably doesn't make sense to you, because everything about this show," he gestured to the studio, "seems built on mocking others for laughs." "This is entertainment, Chuck," Jimmy said weakly. "The audience expects this kind of back and forth. It's part of the format." "No, Jimmy," Chuck replied, shaking his head. "This is mockery, and the fact that you can't see the difference tells me everything I need to know about your values." The camera crew looked uncertain, unsure if they should keep filming. The audience sat in stunned silence as the exchange went beyond what anyone had anticipated. Jimmy's expression had gone pale, though his pride kept him from stepping back entirely. He forced a strained laugh and glanced toward the crowd, as if hoping for support. "All right, Chuck, I think you're blowing this out of proportion," Jimmy said, trying to reassert some control. "This is just how late-night TV works. We make jokes, we keep things light. Maybe you've been out of the industry too long and forgotten how it's done." Chuck stepped closer to Jimmy's desk, prompting the host to instinctively lean back. "Let me make something clear, Jimmy," Chuck said in a calm, steady tone. "I haven't forgotten anything about the entertainment industry. I remember a time when hosts conducted themselves with class and treated guests with basic courtesy. What I've seen tonight isn't showmanship. It's someone trying to boost himself by putting others down." "Hold on just a second," Jimmy responded, his voice rising as frustration crept in. "You don't get to come on my show and tell me how to do my job. I've been doing this a long time. I've interviewed presidents, celebrities, world leaders. They all understood this comes with the format." "This format?" Chuck said, raising his eyebrows. "What exactly does that mean, Jimmy? That holding a microphone gives you permission to be disrespectful? That having someone in the guest chair means you can take shots at them for laughs?" "I'm not being disrespectful. I'm asking valid questions about your career and image," Jimmy said, though his tone wasn't as firm. "No, Jimmy, those weren't valid questions," Chuck replied. "You want to hear what a real question sounds like? Something like, 'Chuck, how did you go from martial arts to acting?' Or what advice would you give to young martial artists today? Even, how do you feel about the internet memes made about you?" He paused for a moment before continuing. "But that's not what you asked. You challenged my achievements, made remarks about my age, hinted I was a fraud, and tried to provoke me into reacting like some sort of act. That's not genuine inquiry." Jimmy's producer waved from offstage, clearly signaling that things had gone too far. But Jimmy seemed focused solely on his own pride. "Chuck, if you can't take a little heat, maybe you shouldn't be in the spotlight," he said, falling back on a familiar phrase. "This is TV. It's meant to be a bit edgy. If you wanted gentle treatment, maybe you should have done Ellen's show." Mentioning Ellen appeared to be the breaking point. Chuck's expression turned more serious, and when he spoke again, it was with the calm authority of someone seasoned by years of discipline. "You know what, Jimmy? You're right. If I'd been looking for respect, I should have gone elsewhere, because clearly it's not something you value or practice." Chuck began to remove his microphone with slow, deliberate motions. "Wait, Chuck, what are you doing?" Jimmy asked, suddenly realizing his guest was preparing to walk off the set. "I'm doing what I should have done 10 minutes ago," Chuck replied evenly. "I'm stepping away from a situation that's become toxic." You can't just leave in the middle of an interview, Jimmy said, the concern rising in his voice as he grasped the seriousness of the moment unfolding on live TV. Watch me, Chuck responded plainly. Come on, Chuck. Don't take it so personally, Jimmy insisted, trying to salvage the moment. We're just having a conversation. This makes for great TV. Chuck turned back, looking at Jimmy with disappointment rather than frustration. This isn't great television, Jimmy. It's a mess. And the worst part is, you don't even realize it. You think embarrassing your guests makes you witty, but all it really does is make you look small. Small? Jimmy echoed, his voice slightly cracking. Yes, small, Chuck confirmed. Insecure, and craving attention. I've met many kinds of people in my life, leaders and followers, those with integrity and those without, but I don't think I've ever encountered someone trying this hard to prove how tough they are, by putting down their own guest. Jimmy stood up behind his desk, his face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and frustration. So you think you're better than me? He snapped. Just because you know martial arts, you think that gives you the right to come on here and disrespect me? It's not about being better than you, Jimmy, Chuck said quietly. It's about being better than this. Just then, security staff began approaching the stage, likely prompted by the increasingly frantic signals from the producers. But Chuck raised a hand, stopping them. There's no need for security, he said calmly. I'm leaving on my own. Unlike some, I know when it's time to walk away. Fine. Go ahead and leave, Jimmy shot back, his voice shaking. Walk out like the coward you really are. Chuck paused briefly at the edge of the stage, then turned back one last time. The studio was completely still, so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Jimmy, Chuck said, his voice cutting through the silence. I've been called a lot of things throughout my life. People have described me as tough, disciplined and determined. I've also heard stubborn, demanding, even difficult at times. But in over 40 years in this industry, until tonight, no one had ever called me a coward. Congratulations, you're the first. With that, Chuck Norris walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage, leaving behind a host visibly pale, an audience frozen in disbelief, and a television moment that would be remembered for years. Jimmy stood behind his desk, microphone in hand, clearly at a loss for how to recover from what had just unfolded. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second of the fallout as he began to realize that his attempt to humiliate Chuck Norris had completely backfired. Well, Jimmy finally said, barely audible, I guess that was Chuck Norris, everyone. But the impact was already made. What was meant to highlight Jimmy's charm and sharp interviewing style had instead exposed him as exactly what Chuck accused him of being, a host who used his platform to tear others down and finally went too far. And that's how Chuck Norris ended up leaving Jimmy Kimmel Live. Not because he was removed, but because he chose to walk away, preserving his self-respect and leaving Jimmy to face the consequences of his own misjudgment. What do you think? Did Chuck handle it the right way, or should he have stayed and pushed through the interview? Let us know in the comments. And make sure to subscribe for more stories just like this.